Hi guys, in this video we're gonna walk you through the process of the materials you need for relief printing. We're gonna talk about inking, and then in the second part of the video we're gonna be talking about printing. So first I wanna show you some of the tools that you guys are gonna be using for this process. Ink. At the studio you guys are gonna find ink on ink canisters like this, and from home you guys are gonna be using your tupperware to store ink. Some other tools that I'm gonna be using is the brayer and some inking knives. Also have ready some of my cleaning supplies such as veggie oil and simple green, along with few rags and some wax paper, which will be great for storing extra ink. And I'll talk about that in a second. I have also my linoleum plate ready. I had gone through the process of identifying the kind of work that I want to make based on my sketches. We carved this block and this is the final result. So I'm gonna go ahead and prepare my ink first. The very first step that I like to go through is to make sure that my surface is clean. So I'm gonna make sure to wipe down my table. There could be potentially some debris, some impurities that might get into my chemistry. So I wanna make sure that the area that I'm working is nice and clean. I'm gonna go ahead and open up my tupperware with some of my ink. And very carefully, also I want my knife to be clean. Very carefully, I'm gonna just get a little bit of it outside. So as you guys can see, this ink is very stiff. It's very creamy. And the more you work with it, the better you become at handling it. So what I like to do to start my inking process is to warm up my ink. So the ink, because it's oil-based, it gets a little bit stiff, it's a little bit cold at the studio. So this ink from the canister is gonna be a little bit stiff. So what I like to do is simply start moving it around. So I have a very good technique to do that, and that is to scrape my ink on my way out and smear the ink on my way in. So I'm constantly like turning my knife around. And this allows me to get those molecules interacted with one another. My ink literally warms up. And as it warms up, it gets a little bit softer, a little bit easier to move around, to manipulate. We are not going to be using any ink modifiers for this demonstration, but those exist. There are modifiers that make your ink softer. There are modifiers that make your ink stiffer. There are modifiers that make your ink translucent. So there's a lot of possibilities within this medium and this material specifically. So as I move my ink, I notice that my ink starts getting a little bit softer. It's a little bit nicer to work with it. And I'm happy. I can feel it a little bit, you know, when it gets a little bit softer. All right, cool. So I think I'm pretty happy. I like to also like spread my ink a little bit to see if there is any impurities, maybe dry ink that might be in the way. So if you guys notice any large chunks of dry ink, you need to remove it, because that would interfere with the process of inking your plate and using your brayer. So if you don't see anything, if it's just nice and clean, then that means you're ready to use it. All right, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and retrieve a little bit of my ink with my knife. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run a bit of ink that is about the width of my brayer. Right, I can put this to the side. And now that I'm ready, I'm gonna roll my ink. So I'm gonna roll my ink in a very specific way. What I wanna do is to have a very even distribution of the ink on my brayer, because when I use my brayer to ink my plate, if the ink is even on my brayer, the ink is gonna be even on my plate. So to do that, I'm gonna start rolling it. So I'm gonna start like charging my ink. At the beginning, I'm just gonna roll it back and forth. But eventually, what I wanna start doing is to make sure that I'm not doing this. I'm not gonna roll it, come to a stop, and roll it back, come to a stop. So I don't wanna just like stop at the beginning, at the end, because that when I lift, that creates a line. And when I ink my plate, that line is gonna translate to the plate. So instead, what I like to do is to roll it, and as I'm rolling it, I lift it, and I let the roller keep the momentum of the movement. So it looks like this. So as I am like kicking it out, it's like rolling by the motion, and that avoids having that stopping line. And it's all in the way your wrist is holding the brayer. So one indication is if it looks really even on the table, it's most likely pretty even on the brayer, and therefore it will be pretty even on the linoleum. So now that I have charged my brayer, I can like see that it is very even all the way across. And something else that is very important is to always charge your brayer lightly. So it is better to build the ink on the plate with very light layers of ink rather than charging your brayer too heavy and adding too much ink all at once. So there is different ways of gauging if you have too much ink or not. One of the ways that we have pinpoint is by the sound that the brayer makes when it rolls the ink on the table. So right now it sounds really good. But if it was too much ink, you would hear it crackling. Like I often refer that sound of the sound that you hear when you are frying bacon. So that's too much. If it sounds like sticky and it sounds like frying bacon, that means you have too much ink. Also by the texture. So you guys might be able to see in the video that this is very nice and even. It's really thin layer. If you had too much ink, then you would see a texture close to the texture of a basketball or an orange peel. That means there is too much ink and you are just most likely going to make a mess on your plate. So remember to be patient and just like pre-making is like cooking. You want to do things slowly and progressively rather than putting too much too fast and ruin the whole batch. So we're gonna do that with pre-making. All right, so I feel pretty happy with the charging of my brayer, and I'm gonna go ahead and ink my plate. So we put the plate on a little piece of newsprint to handle it easier and to also avoid any potential messes. So something that we want to be super careful is with keeping the back of the plate clean. It is hard. We're gonna do our best. So we'll see. All right, so I'm ready to start inking, and I'm not gonna put a lot of pressure. I'm just gonna let the brayer glide across the surface of the linoleum. So little by little, very patiently, with a lot of care and gentleness, I'm gonna start inking my plate. If I notice that I need more ink, we recharge the brayer. And as I move more ink from the table to the brayer, eventually I'm gonna have to add more ink to my rolling or to my roll ink, because the ink is now on the plate. All right. So I think I might actually add a little bit more ink to my table. I feel like it's a little bit thin. So let's go ahead and do that. And again, just a little bit. just a little bit at a time. If you guys do it too much, if there is too much ink, then you have to start the process again. All right. So this is better. It's hard to tell. It's hard to describe when it's ready. Like a lot of other pre-making processes, this is more of a feel, like when you get a little bit more experience with the material, a little bit more familiar with the tools and materials. So this is something that you're gonna have to just try out, print, and figure out if it was too much or too little ink, and all of the other variables involved in the printing process, such as the pressure of the press, and so on. Oops. So another thing that I would like to mention is that idea of like building on the ink slowly and progressively. If I had put too much ink too fast, the smallest detail would have gotten covered by too much ink. They would have just go inside that line, and I would have just lost that detail. So that's why it's important to just build it slowly and progressively, so that we don't lose the smallest detail.
Do I need to add the same amount of ink each time that I'm going to print it?
The answer is yes. In order for you to be consistent with your edition, you're gonna have to add a very similar amount of ink every time. Now, since this was the very first inking, this first inking takes a little bit more ink, just because I'm kind of like building on. But once I print this plate once, the second inking is gonna be different than the first one. But the third is gonna be the same as the second, and the fourth is gonna be the same as the third, and the fifth is gonna be the same as the fourth, and so on. So yes, the very first time you ink a little bit more because you're just like starting fresh, but eventually you need to hit a consistency on how you're inking and how much you're inking. Right, so I feel like this is gonna be good. I can see my ink very nicely distributed on top of my plate. I know that you guys might not be able to see it on the video because I'm using the reflection and the angle of the lights in the room for me to be able to see how much ink is in different areas. So again, these are some like few details that don't translate very well to the video, but again, when you guys start doing this yourself, you're gonna feel it. It's a very this is a process that is very like intuitive, and very much like us getting in tune with these tools and these materials, understanding them, how they behave, what they do, and entering in harmony with them so that we can print and make art with them.